Now, it's my great pleasure to invite Ben Horowitz to the stage. Ben is co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz. Please welcome Ben. Welcome, Ben.
All right, good to see you, Robert.
Thank you.
All right.
It's very exciting to have you here.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions I'd love to ask you about AI, about Andreessen Horowitz, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you got started and what you were working on before A16Z.
Yeah, well, I started as an engineer many, many years ago at a company called Silicon Graphics, which some of you may remember. It's a great company and a great place to work. But then I went to a company called Netscape, which
Never
was,
heard of it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of you are probably too young to have heard of it, but it was kind of the open AI of the day, I guess. I would say the most important thing about Netscape is it was the company that made the open internet the internet. And I think in retrospect, we always think, of course the internet's open. Of course anybody can use it. Of course there's not like a tax from a company on it. And then in the same way we go like, oh, of course, search is proprietary or, social networking is proprietary. But it didn't have to be that way in either direction. And in fact, there was a huge push from Microsoft to make the internet proprietary. And if you go back, if you can get your hands on the first edition of Bill Gates's book, The Road Ahead, which was published in 1995, no mention of the internet. None. And it's not because he didn't know about the internet. It's because he was fielding a rival, which he referred to as the information superhighway, which was known as Microsoft Network. And they had proprietary versions of everything, BBML instead of HTML, and this and that and the other, which stood for Blackbird markup language. But Netscape's kind of big contribution was we kind of put in the functionality that the internet needed for the open version to win. So the internet had no security. SSL was invented at Netscape. It had no programming language. JavaScript was invented at Netscape and so forth. And so a lot of that kind of contributed to the open internet that we have now, which I think is kind of significant because we're also at that kind of place with AI, right? Where there's both, kind of forces in various governments around the world, as well as people in our industry really pushing to outlaw open source, which seems like bizarre and crazy. But I can tell you, in the early days of the internet, they outlawed encryption for a while. And we could not export 128-bit encryption. It was completely illegal. It was considered a munition. And we're like, the code is in every textbook. Like, what are you talking about? But if you have guns, you can stop stuff.
Yeah. Wait, can you expand on this idea of a proprietary internet? Just help us visualize if that had played out, what that would look like.
Well, I think it would look like a lot like the App Store in that Microsoft actually had a kind of a position that they took, and they called it a vigorish. They would get a vigorish, which was like a mafia term, I guess, on every transaction on the internet. So anything you bought, anything you did on the internet, Microsoft would just take a fee, and and you'd go to them and you'd sign up and you'd enter your Microsoft stuff and all that kind of thing, your Microsoft password, and they would give you access and you'd give them your credit card and you'd get on that way.
Yeah.
And like a lot of the early internet version, right, you had CompuServe and AOL and these on-ramps, so it sort of made sense. They were kind of dial-up services that predated the internet for consumers, that the industry would be thinking that way. And look, they all ridiculed the internet because it's like, you can't put security in it after the fact. What are you, stupid? Every engineer knows you can't add security, to a protocol later in the day and all that kind of thing. But,
wait, so what pushes these things one way or the other, whether it's the internet or search or AI?
So it's a combination of people and technology. So if we were kind of going on the internet technology that was kind of present when I got on the internet in the late 80s, where you had to call a guy and get an IP address and then edit Etsy host and plug in the yellow cable. Some of you remember what I was talking about. But like if it remained that internet, with no DHCP and no SSL and so forth, then the proprietary versions would have had a real running start. And then there's, of course, a network effect. So there is kind of this, is the technology good enough? And does somebody step up to making it good enough if it's not? If you look at social networking, we had a technology called RSS, which was the open version of social networking. Nobody ever kind of did with it what people are trying to do now with kind of crypto and Web3, where you could have a fully functional social networking protocol that would support an open version. And so the proprietary things went out. And then, if you look at what's going on with AI, there are like big AI companies, I won't name names, because I think some of them are here. But who are pushing to like literally outlaw open source. I mean, they make statements like, we can't have open source AI. And look, Mark Zuckerberg, whatever you think of him, is a complete hero in the AI world, in that he released Llama. And I know this from like very deep insider information, that there were a lot of people who didn't want him to do that, both inside the company and the government and so forth. And he had the courage to say, look, we need to live in a world where there's not a tax on intelligence in the way that there's a tax on so many other things.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty high stakes thing.
I think it's very high stakes, and it also is like information control when you think about how these systems work and what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say and so forth. Do you want that controlled by a company? Yeah. And like the problem with, most companies have great people and so forth, but it's always bad when you concentrate, like in society, concentrating power tends to lead to bad outcomes. And concentrating the kind of most powerful technology we've ever built in the hands of one or two companies doesn't seem like a good idea.
Yeah. And is open to closed the right axis there, or is it concentrated to distributed? And do you think open models are kind of analogous to open source?
I think so. I mean, I think that, look, the more people who can work on them, who can be in the conversation, who can, have a voice in terms of how these things are used. Look, if nobody has all the power, it generally works out well. And if somebody has all the power, it generally works out badly. This is kind of the big lesson we learned in the last century. A lot of, like, in theory, communism was really good. The problem was it concentrated all the power, out of the private sector into the hands of a very few people, like Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and Ceausescu. And it always turned out the same way. It didn't matter if they were good guys or bad guys. That much power, everybody dies. So
yeah. Yeah, and it's perhaps in the communism example, it's unintuitive at first glance because
because it's marketed as power to the people.
Right.
But it's not. It's all the power in the private sector goes into the government, and then the government is controlled by a few, not the many. And then, okay, what do you do?
And you don't have powerful corporations as a counterbalance.
Yeah, right. Like there's not, powerful corporations or just like more people, like more distributed power.
Yeah.
And they always end up being dictatorships because it just concentration leads to concentration, distribution leads to distribution. So, look, I mean, there are bad people in business, there are bad people in the government, but as long as neither can stomp out the other, that's better.
How did you decide to start a venture capital firm?
Well, it's the best entrepreneurial idea that we had at the time.
Were there other things in contention?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, so a lot of it was based on our experience as entrepreneurs. So, look, as a founder trying to build a company, what you find, and you know this from experience, you don't know what you're doing. Like it's like, oh, I invented this thing. I know how to build a product, but I have no idea how to build a company, let alone run a company, and so forth. And it always felt like to us that, oh, we'd get that from our venture capitalists, like we'd get some help. But that wasn't really how venture capital worked. And we thought, well, that's weird, that they're just going to give us the money and then like some weird advice about how smart they are and how our product should work, which they didn't know anything about. Like, how about like some like help in building a company? Like, how about a network of like people, customers, executives, people we can recruit, call, so forth. Can you help us with DC, all that kind of thing. And it just didn't exist, so that was the idea. And so we want to build a firm for a founder to learn how to run their own company.
And has that vision, was that essentially how it played out? Or did it, did you take it in new directions that you didn't anticipate?
Well, that idea worked,
Yeah.
which is kind of why I'm here now, I guess. Because if it hadn't worked, you'd be like, who is that guy? And I think, so the original idea was just that. It was like we were going to have a better venture capital product, and that would enable us to win deals. And we didn't even really think that much about like picking the deal. We were like, look, if we can win the best deals, then we'll just do that. And that, look, it worked out pretty well. But as we've grown, we've really developed much more focus and expertise and capability around very specific things like AI or crypto or bio or games or any of the kind of fields needs its own network, its own level of expertise, its own capability to help you build that kind of company.
Yeah. How is investing in AI different from other kinds of investing?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest thing that's different is the founders are different. And what I mean by that is, so if you look at, there's a lot of people who I would say don't understand the technology that well that are making investments, and they don't have these problems probably. But if you understand it, the challenge is the thing that is very interesting now are these foundation models. And the people who can build foundation models are the people who have built foundation models, if that makes sense. So if you've not had a very nice, generous, magnanimous company like Google give you a lot of money to go train a model, see what's wrong, make adjustments, learn how it works, and we just give you some money, chances are you're not going to build a model that's very competitive. That's just the way it is. So the people who we fund end up being researchers, as opposed to PhDs in AI and people have done research for many years, as opposed to in the past it's been, it might be a product manager or an engineer or somebody with a different kind of background and a different kind of, maybe capability on how to run a company. And then when they start building the company, most of the people who get hired are similarly AI researchers or, I think Anthropic is half physicists, which is that's not what we're used to funding. So it is very different in that way.
I'm a big fan of researchers.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So does, everything happening in AI today, this is not the first technology wave you've participated firsthand in.
Yeah.
Right? You saw the explosion of the internet, other things as well. Does this feel different? Are there lessons we can learn from the internet?
Well, so there's things that are the same, but there's a lot that's different. So, one, just technologically, there's, the history of computers is a history of of computing is the history of computers and networks. And the internet was clearly a network, and AI, I think, is clearly like a new kind of computing platform. So they're kind of fundamentally different in that sense. The thing that's the same, very much the same, like just from a, being around it, is in the beginning of the internet, every single day you'd be like, whoa, look at that, somebody built that. Oh my God, I can't believe they built that. And AI is very much like that, so like every day there's some new thing that comes out that you go, wow, I can't believe it can do that. And so it's really exciting in that way. I think it's different in that, one, there wasn't nearly as much government scrutiny on the internet as there is on AI. And then I would say like companies are way more on board, like big old companies with AI than they ever were with the internet in the beginning. Like the internet, they were so not on board. I'll give you just two kind of funny examples. The first thing they said was like, screw the internet, we're not doing that. We'll maybe use HTTP and HTML inside our company, we'll have an intranet. And then they're like, well, we do need to talk to partners, so we'll have an extranet. And and then finally they're like, F it, we'll do the internet. But even then, at Sun Microsystems, which was like the big Unix company of the day, they banned the internet for employee use, and I think it was 95. And at the time, like I think Eric Schmidt was the CTO of the company, so like they had like real guys in the company. But that the internet was like, nah, that's not for business. That's just some porn.
I see.
Kind of like the waifu thing. It's like, yeah, we can have employees talking to the waifus all day.
Yeah. And I mean, what do you think is the reason that, is this just businesses maturing, that they're adopting new technologies faster, or?
Well, I think partly it's because, the internet, information gets disseminated so fast that it's hard to miss. When the internet came out, like, you would have to read about it you could like read about it in some like weird magazine. There was like a newsletter called The Red Herring that you could buy, but that was like, and there was Dr. Dobbs, but there's not like that much like technology publications in those days in the beginning. And so like it was easier to miss. And then if you watched it on TV, some of you have seen the funny clips of the internet with Bryant Gumbel and so forth going, is it a post office? It sends email, is there a stamp? That kind of thing. And so people kind of dismissed it at that point. And they also looked at it for what it was, as opposed to what it was going to be. And, I remember in 95, we went to see all of the, or maybe it was 94, we went to see all of the big magazine and newspaper publishers and say, hey, you ought to invest in Netscape because like this internet thing is going to affect your business. And they were like, you're an idiot. Like nobody's going to use that thing. Like it's never going to read it. You need paper in your hands and all that kind of thing. And so none of them invested. I'm laughing because it's kind of funny in retrospect. Yeah.
I mean, the internet had a few, maybe more than a few big winners like Google and Amazon and other companies. Does the way that played out affect or inform how you think about how the AI ecosystem will evolve and who will be the winners there?
I mean, somewhat. Like I think it's the same, but it's different. So, you can't take too much into that. But like the very early days of the internet, the kind of most promising company by far, I think, was eBay. And then, Yahoo was probably the other one that like had all the momentum in the, in this period of the internet, like that we're in now with AI. And those weren't like the biggest. Amazon, if you go back to, I think it was 2001, Barron's wrote a huge takedown piece that said they were worthless. And then Google, didn't get started until 98. And when Google went public, I think they were worth about half of what Yahoo was worth. So like people didn't have a great gauge on like who the big winners were going to be. Certainly, even later than this stage, but not at this stage. And I think with AI, you know, that's true too. Like, you know, what's going to happen? What's going to happen with regulation? You know, how are the models going to evolve? Like, do we reach an asymptote on, like, you know, training scale or not? Looks like not right now, but we'll see. And so all those kinds of things, I think, will play into which companies end up being, you know, super important 20 years from now.
That's a great point. You mentioned there was more, or there is more regulatory scrutiny in AI now than
Way
the
more.
internet.
Yeah.
What do you see as the opportunities for regulators to either get that right or to screw it up?
It's hard to imagine them getting it right. Just if you look at, you know, everywhere there's been heavy regulation, there's been a lack of innovation. It's funny, you know, once in a while I'll go to like one of these kind of events in Europe and what have you. And in Europe, they always say, we're not the leaders in innovation, but we're the leaders in regulation. And I always go, you don't realize those go together? like it's very tricky in the early days. I don't know how I would regulate it, right? Like, and I know a lot more about AI than anybody in the Senate. And so it's pretty complicated to regulate something that's evolving so fast. And I think that's that's a danger with it. I would say that if you were going to regulate it, and this is what I say, you know, to my friends in Washington, D.C., you know, like if this was nuclear, because everybody keeps comparing it to nukes, you know, which is, I think it's a little different, but okay. You know, would you regulate the bomb or like refining plutonium, or would you regulate the physics? You know, physics is illegal. And what I think a lot of the people are advocating for is to make physics illegal or require a license to do physics, you know, as far as AI goes. And I think that's the worst thing that you could do. I think it's fine if you go, look, there's so many things that are illegal to do, like you can't publish how to make a bomb or how to kill yourself. Or like that's illegal already, and so it should be illegal for AI, and that seems fine. But the existing set of laws works reasonably well. Now there is a new kind of thing or a new issue, which is, you know, how does it affect copyrights? And there's kind of copyright, and I wrote something and the AI read it and got smart and said something totally different. That doesn't seem to be like a real violation, but you know, you could imagine a regulation that made it such. On the other hand, I'm like, I recorded Drake's voice and made a song, and I said it was a Drake song. Like, that does seem like a violation. And so there are those kinds of issues which, for sure, are going to have to be dealt with.
Yeah. Do you think the way that some of these issues you brought up are resolved, you know, will have big implications for just the rate of progress?
Yeah, oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, I think that, look, one of the things that I think it was at the, one of the board meetings I was in, maybe it was a Databricks board meeting, but like one of the things that people said is, you know, like we could be in the consumer AI Napster moment, in that like the government could turn around and just make this all illegal tomorrow, you know, because it basically slurped in the internet. And oh, by the way, you can get it to do a lot of privacy violations. You know, for sure, it's like way outside the bounds of what the EU allows already. Like, I ask it about me, and it tells me all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, I didn't authorize you to do that, and these kinds of things. So you could imagine if the regulation went a certain way that, like, they would just go, okay, you know, you are so liable for what your AI says in terms of privacy, copyright, if you've read anything that somebody didn't give you permission for, that it's just all illegal, and you could never actually have a business because you'd get sued out of business. So like that could happen. And like I said, like Napster, I think Napster was a good analogy because everybody who's using Napster is great. They wanted to pay the music company for licensing deals and so forth, but you know, the whole thing was deemed illegal and shut down, and then things evolved in a kind of different fashion.
Yeah. You mentioned, you know, it's still early days of AI. It's a little early to see, you know, to say for sure who the winners will be.
Yeah.
But when you think about the different, you invest in a lot of different layers of the AI ecosystem, like infrastructure, LLMs, applications. Do you feel like there are missing pieces in the ecosystem, places that you would expect to emerge or you would want to invest in, but hasn't seemed to emerge yet?
Yeah, well, there's definitely like many missing pieces. Like, certain things are more complicated than they will be in terms of, doing embeddings and this and that, and just at the tool level. And then, when you get into like an enterprise environment and you actually have things like access control that people care about and so forth, I think that's like very difficult today in an LLM world. So there's many. I think there's many things to get built, but the fundamental technology is moving too. So as that advances, there will be kind of more things. And then the interesting thing with this technology is like the technology is like pretty good at, like you can, we keep talking about prompt engineering and like how that's going to be really important, but then like the technology is pretty good at prompting itself. You can just ask it, hey, could you ask yourself in the right way?
I'm always amazed when you can.
Yeah, like it's really weird how good it is. Like you got to keep getting more and more meta and just like let it figure it out.
Yeah, I'm always amazed when you can ask these things the same question in a slightly different way and just get, tell it to answer as if it's Albert Einstein, and it just does way better.
Yeah, and we have a company we invested in called Audiogram, and like if you look at their usage, it's really interesting because a lot of it is just the same prompt over and over and over again, and it's generating a different picture off the same prompt. So it's like, I'm not even going to change my prompt. I just want to see, give me all your ideas. Like I want to see 100 of your ideas on this prompt. And so it's hard to even imagine where it's going to go.
I wanted to ask you about the chip shortage. We just heard from a bunch of companies building hardware accelerators, and you mentioned that there was some parallels with the internet as well.
Yeah, so there was like a massive bandwidth shortage if you go back to 1998, 1999. Everybody wanted onto the internet, and there was like dial-up and copper wire and no fiber anywhere and all this kind of thing. And so just to give you an economic idea, so in like November of 1999, I think bandwidth was $1,500 a megabit was what you paid for bandwidth. And by the way, you had to buy it on 3-year deals. Sound familiar? And then by early 2001, it was $50 a megabit.
So 1,500 to 50.
50. Yeah. And there was a massive wave of bankruptcies among telecom companies coming out of that. And bankruptcies and fraud. So I think probably half of the telecom companies in the US went bankrupt. It can happen very fast. You can go from shortage, like, when are we not going to need more bandwidth? Never. So like, let's buy a lot of it, to, we have more bandwidth than people need at the moment. And I think that, in GPUs, that's a real possibility, I'll just say.
Yeah.
I try and buy for shorter terms than 3 years if you can.
Yeah, so does that mean it's a good time or not a good time to start a chip company or a cloud provider?
Well, it's interesting. 1999 turned out to be like a really bad time to start a telecom company. I don't know if that will translate. I do think, the fact that we're using, chips that we made for like graphics and video games and then applied to like Bitcoin mining, and now we're applying to this. Like maybe there's, I don't know, I suppose there might be something that somebody could figure out that would be more dedicated. But I also think like if you knew it was going to be the transformer model forever, then that would kind of inform you maybe in a different way.
You could optimize for that much more confidently.
Yeah, then if the models are going to change again, and there's obviously lots of debate on that.
Yeah. I mean, so investing in AI can be very capital intensive, right? Because you're training these models spending hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least maybe
Billions. Billions in some cases, yes.
Yeah. How does that factor into does that change the calculation for investing in these kinds of companies?
Yeah, no, look, I think that if you're that's why there are only a few extreme, large model competitors right now. But I think that, look, that'll move around a bit, particularly as the GPU shortage alleviates. And, we're seeing actually interesting things, with very large models being built in the Middle East where power is extremely cheap. So, there's that kind of factor too. So we'll see. It's a little hard to predict, but yeah, probably so.
So one topic that I know is near and dear to your heart is management. You've written a lot about management advice. Mm-hmm. Can you, first of all, share anything about how you became such a great manager?
Yeah, by being a bad manager.
Yeah.
Look, I think the only way to learn how to actually run something is the hard way. I wrote a couple of books on it, and hopefully they're helpful, but you can't quite learn it from a book in that it's like trying to learn how to play NFL quarterback, by reading a book. It's all fine, and I'm sure it could be helpful, but once there's a 300-pound person running at you really fast, going to kill you, it kind of changes how you process information. Yeah. And management's a lot like that, when somebody is really angry with you, who's a high performer or whatever, two people are fighting with each other that you like, or, it gets the dynamic nature of the situation and the kind of specific situation that you're in changes things. You do need some experience to learn how to deal with that.
Yeah. We're not always good at predicting what tasks will be easy for AI mm-hmm. and what tasks will be hard for AI, right? Many people expected solving math problems to be easier for AI than writing poetry. Yeah. But it appears to be the opposite. So I'm curious, where do you think management is hard for people? How do you see that playing out for AI?
Well, it's interesting because my partner, Mark, would say, AI is going to just replace all the CEOs, definitely. But, he was never good at managing, so. Yeah. It could be. In my view, the difficult part about management is always the psychological, emotional part. The easy part is, the very easy part is kind of the theory of management. You need maybe a 7th or 8th grade education in math and being reasonably smart, and you can understand the theory of it. It just gets difficult because it gets so personal so fast, mm-hmm. and then you have everybody has an individual personal interest and a company interest, and once you start running things, you find that the company definitely doesn't always come first for everybody. It may come first for you, but not for everybody in the company. And then and that's where the complexity is. So it depends how good AIs get at, I guess, understanding humans. If, in fact, they're managing humans. If they're managing other AIs, then that could work out really well.
Maybe it could work extremely well. Yeah. Ben, this has been a pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much.
A lot of fun.
Please thank Ben.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert.